fall that started in Egypt, went to Israel, and then on to Cyprus. And I actually wanted to do this trip because I mapped out areas along the Middle East through to Cyprus that were Templar in origin. But then I wanted to look at Egypt because of all of the things that are in Masonic ritual. And so what I did for this trip is I started in Cairo, where we did some things, then took a flight to Luxor. Luxor, if you know the Nile River, is in two parts. The north half is above the first cataract, the south is below that. And there is now a way to get through that. They have locks now that allow you to get past that, but without those, it was never navigable from north to south. So much of what developed south of the first cataracts was done as a result of a railroad which had been built from Cairo down to the Aswan Dam by the French, who were the contractors on the dam. So what we did was flew into Luxor, where we boarded a boat and spent 9 days floating on the Nile River, down to Aswan, and then back up again. After that, we were back to Cairo and a flight to Jerusalem, which this is September last year, remembering October the 7th. Security was a little tight. So it took 3 times as long to get through security as the flight took for that. But when there, we made a couple of side trips. We were out at Masada, which is phenomenal. We were supposed to stop at Bethlehem in the West Bank, but that became impossible as a result of the security. And then from there, down to Cyprus, which at one time the Templars owned in its entirety. And there's quite a story for that. Some background for Egypt. There were 31 dynasties in Egypt, covering the period 3100 BC to 30 BC. In 30 BC, it became known as the Roman era. The last ruler was Cleopatra VII. And following her, the Romans dominated the region. The pyramid culture in Egypt began in earnest in 2667 BC with the construction of what is called the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, which was the original capital of Egypt. It was also the first pyramid built in Egypt. And it was actually built in sections, and it took a long time. They were just kind of figuring out how to do this at the time. And today, you can't actually get into that one. But because it is near Cairo, it's also very close to the pyramids at Giza, which is also at Cairo. And they are, I'll get to that shortly, but they're entirely different. The Egyptians used hieroglyphics as a written language at the time. And we were talking about this earlier, that refreshment. In 196 BC, a Rosetta Stone was created. And that stone had on it carved the same message in hieroglyphs, demotic, and ancient Greek. Up to that point, there had never been an actual translation of hieroglyphs into any other language. That stone was lost. And in 1799, it was discovered by an English archaeologist. And it was only from that point on that they were able to start to translate the glyphs and what they meant. So this unlocked an incredible history inside the pyramids and the temples. Pythagoras lived from 570 to 495 BC, and I bring that up because he's mentioned in our first degree work. It involves the Euclid's 47th problem. And the school that he established in Italy was actually at one point finally sanctioned by the Roman Catholic Church, or the Christians at the time, because, as would happen later when it became far more organized, they disagreed. Because he was very mysterious in what he did, and his school had secrets. And the question became, did he spend any time in Egypt? Because it is estimated that he did, and that much of what he learned in mathematics came from there. So it goes back to, how does knowledge, right? In Masons, what do we say? Knowledge moved from the east to the west. So the trip started 3 days Cairo. Did the Cairo Museum, which was disappointing only because they have a new museum being built, and they had literally moved the bulk of the exhibits over to the new one, because the old museum was a terrible place for artifacts. It had no climate control. It had, it was just open air, which meant that the 5,000 pieces from the Tut tomb were at the new museum, and we didn't get to see them. Right? They kept 6 pieces in the old museum just to keep the tourists coming. So, and that was, kind of a difficult thing for us, because that's really something we were looking forward to. The step pyramid. So, I'm just going to watch my time a bit here. So the Giza pyramids, and this is sort of the beginning of the true Egyptian building program. If anyone is familiar with them at all, they are astrologically aligned in a perfect line. And everybody was very curious about aligned with what, until someone finally clicked onto the fact that they were built 5,000 years ago and the sky was different. Stars and planets had moved relative to us, but they are absolutely perfectly in line. Each one of them is a perfect square within 5 centimeters on the 4 sides. The angles are absolutely perfect on all 4 points of all 3 pyramids. And the tools that they had to work with are right there. That's all they had. So the one distinction that they had was that for the chisel, they had metal. In Central and South America, where they also built pyramids, they had no metal. So they used granite to chip limestone. The Egyptians went into mass production because they had metal. It's also a key part in how they were building a lot of the temples. So imagine this. You have massive temples and pyramids in a land prone to earthquakes. Right? In the 1990s, they had earthquakes that decimated large parts of their structures in Egypt. What's fascinating was none of the ancient structures were damaged in any way. They did not have Roman concrete. But what they would do, so the pyramids, the stones at the bottom of the pyramids weighed 4,500 tons each. 450 tons each. And as they went to the top, they got smaller and smaller because they had to drag them further up. So at the top, they're only 250 tons. And what they did was just built ramps all the way around as it was built. And then as they took the ramps down, they put the granite face on, and then plastered that. Now, all of that material was brought up the Nile River from areas down by the first cataracts. The interesting thing was that at the time, the Nile River actually was right beside these sites, and they had special ramps and docks built for the barges that would bring the material in, and and they would roll them off the barges, out of the ramp, and straight up the pyramid. Today, the river is like 15 kilometers away. And there are pictures of the pyramids, and the water is literally lapping up along the bottoms of them. And also the Great Sphinx, which is also located there, was in water. Moving through to when it was then discovered, and we'll call it in recent times, it was actually buried in sand right to the chin. And no one thought that there was anything to it. It was just another marble stone head laying in the sand. Until an archaeologist got curious one day and started to dig it out. And it is massive and impressive. So all of these things were done with workforces that involved anywhere up to 25,000 people. So when they would build these temples and the pyramids, whole cities would spring up around them. Because what the Egyptians did was they paid the workers. Unlike the Romans, who used slaves, captives. And so they had because some of these structures took anywhere up to 50 years to build. Much like the cathedral constructions in Europe, which could take 100 years. It might have 3 generations, one family working on one building. So as time went by, anybody remember the efforts that were made to take the Abu Simbel temple, carve it out of a mountain, and move it before the waters flooded that area? Right? Huge undertaking. They literally moved an entire mountain. There was an effort to do this with dozens and dozens of sites. One of the sites that didn't get moved right away was at Philae Island, which is south of the cataracts. And what they ended up having to do was build a 3-wall coffer dam around this island, pump all the water out, because it was all submerged at that point. They then took everything that was there apart and moved it to a new island. The reason they did this was, as a temple, it had been there, the original temple had been there for about 2,500 years before the Romans came along, and the Roman emperors, for some reason, decided they liked the way that Egyptian rulers were deified. So on this island, there was a Roman structure as well. So they actually took all of that apart and moved that with the Egyptian temple. It's fascinating to see. Now, the other area that we went to in that area was the Valley of the Kings. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. So it's the Valley of the Kings and Queens. So there are 2 of them. The Valley of the Kings was picked because it was inaccessible. It had a little pyramid-like structure, mountain peak on it at the back end, which they liked. And at that point, looting was so bad in every other structure in Egypt, they needed a way to protect the mummified remains. Religiously, what they assumed was that if the mummified remain was in any way disturbed, then the soul would never make it to the afterlife. It would be in limbo forever. So in the Valley of the Kings, what they did was they didn't do pyramids. They dug into the mountain and hid the entrances. So at this point, they have found 112 tombs that they've actually entered. There are more that they know of. They just have no way to deal with what's in them, if anything, because they're just running out of space. But of the 112 tombs that they encountered, only 3 were intact. The interesting thing was the priests, knowing what was happening, created a separate, secret structure, cave underground, and moved all the mummies into it. So when it was recently found, there were over 100 caskets in there with the mummified remains. It gave them the opportunity to match the mummies against all of these little tombs they've been finding inside the mountain. And can you imagine the priests at this point going, we don't care about the gold and the silver and all the other stuff. Let them have it. We got to save the mummies. And they had them all stacked and all numbered. And the names of their, were all recorded on the sides of them. And that's how they have recently been able to catalog and identify what is actually in the Valley of the Kings. They also know through LiDAR that there are lots more. They just don't want to open them up. So we did go down. So what they do now is they keep 2 tombs open for the public to go into. And so I went down into one. Right? And you're going down, and it's basically a tunnel, 4 feet square. Right? So you're like me, you're doing this for 250 feet going in on a slope. You get to a chamber, and this is sort of where things got organized to a smaller group inside, because then there would be a second one that would go to the preparation room, which would then be connected to the actual burial chamber. And walking into the burial chamber itself, the paint, the art, so the paintings in it were still absolutely pristine. And I'm walking in there, and I looked up, and it was a blue ceiling with thousands of stars. And I thought about the Entered Apprentice lecture. The celestial canopy. Absolutely stunning. And still intact after thousands of years. One of the problems they have now is that every time they open one of these up, they have to be very careful for how long they allow it. Because of the people going in, down, and around, it's creating damage. And the damage isn't from people touching or feeling or doing things. The humidity that we give off is actually eating away at the plaster on the walls. Our body temperatures, because these are deep underground, and they should be cool, the sheer volume of people moving through them is raising the temperatures in them and that creates damage. So now what they have to do, have one open for a while, close it, they ventilate it, dry it out, get everything back to normal. In the meantime, they'll have another one that they have open. Right? Because at that part of Egypt, tourism is 80% of their economy. So they got to keep them coming. But that's how they're trying to manage it, right? So out of 112, they're keeping 2 to 3 open at a time just to try and protect them. In the temples, and I have some photographs, which I'll have out in the back later. But there are temples that are 4,000 years old where you can stand and look up and actually see it's absolutely amazing, the paint structure and all natural pigments. So it was stone, they would cover it with a compound, and then the natural paints would bond to that really, really well, and literally thousands of years later, it's still there. The other thing that happened was that over the centuries, subsequent to the dynasties, as one person said to us, the Egyptians must have invented graffiti. Because you would walk into a temple and there'd be a cross chiseled into the wall over top of the hieroglyphs. In another one, we walked in and looked up, and So Christians had occupied the site, and they had literally chiseled the face smooth, plastered it, and painted a scene from the Last Supper in like a 3,000-year-old temple. Right? And you could see smoke stains from where they'd had their altars and were burning candles. And European archaeologists chiseling their name into the wall in a temple they'd found. It's kind of like Kilroy was here. It's, I was like, come on, you guys, you're supposed to save it. One of the last stops we went to, this is just out of pure interest, was, of course, the river was filled with alligators, in that time. And they had a god, Hathor. And as a deity, he was represented by a human form with an alligator's head. So they started to mummify alligators. I go into this museum, and literally there's like rows of mummified alligators that they have found. And it was the things they would do. And they actually did that with a lot of animals. So in the end, the things that I found fascinating, and this goes back to the building now. One of the reasons their buildings didn't collapse during the earthquakes was that you take large blocks of stone and they would carve the wedge into the two matching stones, and they would pour copper into that to create a connected wedge. Or they would use a block of wood. So what these did was they provided enough flexibility that when the earthquakes hit, they would move but not break. And then they ledged one edge so that as they came in and fit, they could slide this way without sliding off. And they did this with those tools. Nothing more than that. So it's absolutely fascinating that they could survive through 31 dynasties from 3100 BC literally to 30. And fight off Assyrians, Syrians, Romans, Persians. And they learned and took knowledge from everyone. If there was someone that they were at war with, they would look at the weapons that their enemy was using. If they were of value, they copied them. Following this, we actually headed for Jerusalem, which was, so the Israeli National Museum had just built a brand new facility for the Dead Sea Scrolls, in which they have housed now the largest continuing piece of papyrus record, which is 38 feet long, I think. And they have it displayed in a big circular form. So that was pretty cool. But outside that building, 60 or 70 years ago, someone decided as a hobby that he would build a replica of the city of Jerusalem at the time of Christ. This model is to scale and uses the same original stone that Jerusalem was built from. This thing is almost 2 acres in size. And when it was first found and set into storage, they had to cut this thing into sections so they could stack and store it all. And it was, this thing is so accurate that I was standing on the edge of it and I'm looking down at it and I went, that's the Via Dolorosa, is the walk of Christ. As the Stations of the Cross, and we walked that. And then we did the Temple Mount, which is fascinating because that's where the Templars had their headquarters when in Jerusalem, where the temples are, to this day, Israelites will not walk on the Temple Mount because they don't know quite where the Solomon's Temple is, so they don't want to walk over it. It could well be underneath the Golden Mosque, which is sitting on top of the whole thing and is massive. 2,500 individual pieces of ceramic tile. The dome it's not gold leaf, it's actual gold plate. And was restored a number of years ago at apparently significant cost. At Masada, everybody's familiar with the tale of Masada? You go to the top of Masada today, which, by the way, was built by the Romans and occupied by Christians, Jews, Romans, Syrians. But if you stand on the top of it today, you can see all the Roman encampment locations. There's it's a dry desert. It's amazing. They had 5 full Roman legions, 25,000 soldiers against 900 Jewish warriors. And the crazy part is they built a ramp, physically built a ramp from the valley bottom to the gates of Masada at the top, and then rolled battering rams up it. Right. Holy crap. And at that point, the occupants committed suicide rather than give in to the Romans. And so that to me was to watch that. So it took them 9 months to build that ramp. And it was built with Jewish prisoners of war. Slave labor. The original intent of the site of Masada, because it was Herod who built it, was to provide a retreat for the Roman emperor should he come and visit the Middle East, which he never did. And so they abandoned it. Cyprus was interesting for those that are not familiar with the tale. In 1189, Richard I was on his way to the Middle East, and it was called the Crusade of the Kings, because there were 3 monarchs. On the way, he was to stop at Cyprus, meet his fiancée, and they were to be married there. The king of Cyprus at the time seized her ship when it landed and refused to let them off, provided no water and no food. Richard arrives. He's got a crusading army behind him. Decides, you're not going to be here anymore. Invades the island, seizes it. 3 days later, it's his. But now he's spent a ton of money and he needs cash. So he sold the island to the Templars, who then gave him the money to carry on with his crusades. And then following the fall of Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem bought it from the Templars and established himself as the monarch of the island, and his family ruled for 400 years. But absolutely fascinating that the Templars would sit there and look at it, because they had done their usual international banking thing for the crusading army in the first place. But that they would turn around and cut a deal. Yeah, we'll just buy this whole thing. We'll do that. And then they built fortifications and did things. But this island, when you look at the forts within the primary harbor area, the tombstones around it are Muslim primarily. But there are Crusader tombstones. So it's pretty cool. But Greeks and the Turks had no interest in archaeology, and virtually most of the history has been destroyed by building. Absolutely crazy. So anyway, we're done. I think Will's, did I wake you up?
We'll clap.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.